Hey, welcome to Wonderful Works Talks, where we talk all about the disability ministry mission of helping churches become accessible for all. I'm your host, Barb Stanley, and today we're going to talk about something that is really important when it comes to understanding others, but is also rarely talked about at church, especially when we talk about serving kids. And that is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. But before we dive into this super fascinating topic, I want to stop and ask a question. When we see someone who's behaving in a way that we don't understand, how often do we ask ourselves, what's wrong with them? And what question do you think we should be asking instead? Well, today we're going to find that out and so much more as we talk to speaker, blogger, and author Jolene Philo. Jolene is the author of Does My Child Have PTSD? And the co-author, along with Gary Chapman, of Sharing Love Abundantly in Special Needs Families, the 5 love languages of parents raising children with disabilities. And she has authored many more books. Now, before we get started, I do want to let you know something special about this episode. This interview with Jolene ran as part of our original WW Talks webcast interviews on YouTube a while back. So if you've been a longtime member of the Wonderful Works community, it may sound familiar. But because it's such a great interview and so personally helpful to me as I've been unpacking some of my own PTSD, we wanted to run it again so that more people could hear it. So we have reformatted it as an audio podcast. And I'm so glad that we did, because I know that what Jolene has to share is going to help a lot of people. So without further ado, we are so excited to welcome Jolene Philo.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
So I read your book, Does My Child Have PTSD, from cover to cover, and I actually learned quite a bit. It was really illuminating and helpful. Can you tell us a little bit about your story and why you wanted to write that book?
Yeah, it's nothing I ever thought I would be writing about, ever. And actually, the story began about 40 years ago with the birth of our first child. He was born in 1982, and we discovered soon after his birth that he had a life-threatening condition that needed immediate surgery for him to survive. So he had surgery before he was a day old. To make a very long story short, by the time he was 5, he'd had a total of 7 surgeries and hundreds of procedures, invasive procedures and tests and things.
Now, for those listening, there is one important thing to know here. Back then, doctors mistakenly believed that babies could not feel pain. And so many babies were not given anesthesia or pain management for medical procedures. And this included Jolene's son. It wasn't until 1987 that the American Academy of Pediatrics formally announced that it was unethical to operate on infants without anesthetics.
Mm-hmm. He had another surgery when he was 15 to complete some repair issues. Other than that, it seemed like he didn't really have any other issues. He did well in school. He developed normally. So he did very well until about junior high, when we started seeing some behavior issues. A lot of impulsiveness, inability to explain his emotions, inability to carry through on promises. And then after his junior year in high school, he ran away for the first time. That began a pattern that lasted till he was about 26, when he called us from where he was living and asked, he said, I don't know what's going on here. I need some help. Can you help me figure it out? And truly, by the grace of God, we still didn't have any language for PTSD. My husband and I were suspecting by that time that what was going on maybe had to do with all that medical trauma, but we really didn't know. Yeah. So we were led to a facility where they were able to treat his PTSD, diagnose it, and he went through a week-long outpatient therapy that changed his life completely. And he's doing very well now. I mean, he still has, you always have vestiges of those kinds of things, but he lives a good life. A few years later, our soon-to-be son-in-law realized he was dealing with some trauma issues and went and was treated at the same clinic. At that point, I decided, oh my goodness, I'm going to go with them. And they wanted me to and interview everybody there, because nobody outside the mental health care community really gets that this is a big thing.
Mhm.
So I went, I interviewed everybody there. They gave me all sorts of reading to do. And that eventually led to my book, which was published in 2015. There is nothing in it that is brand new or earth shattering. It just takes what the mental health care community has known for a long time. And I think explains it in more user friendly language for those of us who are lay people, whether we're
Yeah.
parents or teachers or with people in the church that want to know how to help kids who are dealing with trauma.
Yeah, well, I think your story is really important for many reasons. But one of those reasons is because I think a lot of times when we think of trauma, we think about one big event has happened to someone, or they have had a life of abuse, or things like that. We think, yes, this is trauma, everything else, no. Medical procedures and surgeries, when they come a lot, can also be traumatic. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Sure. And especially in the case of someone like my son, who was a newborn, um,
Mhm.
they remember what's happening from birth on. There is even evidence now that babies in the womb remember things because they can turn to their mother's voice in the delivery room and such not. So if they're in a traumatic environment, they may have memories, and these are called implicit memories. And we all have those. They begin at birth. We develop them throughout our lives, but we aren't aware that they're memories. We tend to think of our explicit memories as the ones that matter. Those begin when we're around 2.5, and they're that movie reel that runs through our mind where we can look back and see what happened in our lives. But the early memories, whether they're medical trauma or abuse or neglect or anything, being in an accident when you're very, very young, we remember those traumatic experiences as sensations like hot and cold, emotional sensations, visual images, sounds, smells, those kinds of things. And they sit in our right brain, and we don't even realize what they are. We just sometimes have this feeling of, why am I so uneasy? Why do I feel so unsafe?
Mhm.
And so we have to help children that young, and any child, because they're vulnerable and they don't know how to do this themselves. We have to be the ones that help those children process those memories and come to a point of understanding they're no longer being threatened and they can
Right.
move on with life.
Right. Yeah. So what you're saying is, someone can have these feelings and sensations in their body, in their brain, and not realize it, and that can show up in behaviors later that may be puzzling
Yes.
to everyone, including the person.
Yes, because anytime that memory is triggered and they don't even know it's a memory, they're going
Mhm.
to show some behaviors probably related to the age they were when the event happened. So if you were 6 months old when the event happened, however you responded then is not going to be highly appropriate, even for a 5-year old, 10-year old, and certainly not for an adult. So
Right.
we've got to figure out why they're acting that way. And so the good question to ask instead of what is wrong with you
Mhm.
is what's happened to you.
Mm,
And if we
that's
can
good.
start looking at people that way, it reframes our perspective, and we're in a much more compassionate, caring position, a Christ like position to help people then.
I love that. So instead of what is wrong with you, what has happened to you? That really does
Yeah.
change the whole feel of it.
Totally. Yeah.
Yes, that
Yeah.
is great. For those who are wondering, what does PTSD sometimes look like in a child? How would they be able to maybe recognize maybe something is wrong?
That's a really good question. And that is kind of broken down in my book. So if people really want a real detailed look at it, you might want to pick up the book. Of course, it's different for birth to 3 to 6, and then of course when you get into adolescence, it's going to look different too. But I think a few things that you should really be looking for, whatever the age of the child, are they having sleep disturbances? That carries through at any age, and I think it's because
Mhm.
when it's time to sleep, we can no longer keep our minds busy and keep
Yeah,
those memories away.
yeah,
And so when sleep comes, those children will have problems with getting to sleep, staying asleep, and having a lot of nightmares. poor sleep habits just all around. Other things you might be looking for are highly emotional responses to events. It makes sense that here's the best example I've ever heard. If you tell a toddler they can't have a cookie, they're going to throw a little fit or cry or whatever. If you tell a toddler dealing with trauma they can't have a cookie, they're going to be flat out screaming for a long time, flailing on the floor for 20 minutes. So their response is way out of line with the event. You might see kids trying to avoid places where the trauma occurred. So they're going to say, you know, I don't feel good when they have to go to ball practice, if it's happening at ball practice or school or wherever it may be. They also might complain of a lot of hard to pin down physical things like stomach aches and headaches and those kinds of things. And they truly are having them because they're either so tense about the remembered trauma that their headaches or their stomach hurts. You know, it's tied up in knots. So those are some of the things you're going to see a lot. As kids get older, you might start seeing things like impulsive behavior, you know, into adolescence, substance abuse or self-harming kind of things. And I would say also another one is maybe depending on the event that happened, even in elementary school on up, they may have an unusual preoccupation with death and be very concerned that they're going to die or someone they love is going to die.
Yeah, that is very interesting. So I think one thing I was always taught is that behavior is communication. I hear that a lot. And what you're saying with children that have been through trauma, I think a lot of times it's easy for us to see a child who's overreacting to something and just think they are misbehaving or they're being willful. That's really a sign that something is bothering them deeply.
That's right. Because remember, if it's a traumatic memory and it hasn't been processed, they have no words. It's those implicit memories stored in the right brain. They have no words. So all they can do is act. And so their behaviors are their words.
Another thing I noticed when I read your book, because I kind of looked through some of those things you just described, and there's many of them on that list that also seem to be the same as maybe things like autism or different types of things. So how does a parent know if this might be a neurological disorder or trauma, or what should they do if they suspect that something is wrong?
Yeah. And there are a lot of other mental conditions that mimic or PTSD copycats them. Things like attention deficit disorder, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, panic attacks, anxiety, depression, bipolar. There's a number of those. But what I always tell people is if it looks like it's trauma symptoms or symptoms of PTSD, and you know this child has a history of trauma, start there and go and see if you can get some help. Because really, if you can help kids process those unresolved traumatic memories, you can resolve the PTSD and those symptoms. And then once those are gone, you can see what's left and treat those other things.
So would their first step be going to their pediatrician, or who should they reach out to first?
I think if they know it's a trauma history, I would say just see if you can find a therapist.
The earlier you go for therapy, the better. You find that to be helpful for kids, or is there a certain age where it's better?
No, that is absolutely true. Usually you can start doing therapy with children as soon as they become verbal enough to help to be part of the activity of changing those wordless memories into a narrative with words. So they have to have enough vocabulary to do that. So around 3 usually is a good time. Or if you have a child who's dealing with developmental delays, if they're at the developmental level of 3, you can do it then. If you have children who are nonverbal in that they cannot speak, but they can understand, I think as long as they have an understanding at least a 3-year-old level, you could work with them too, because they're going to be able to tell the story to themselves in their heads. You know, they understand words, they just can't express that. So that's a really good time to start. And the sooner, the better, because let's talk just a little here about the difference between trauma and PTSD. We all have trauma in our
Yeah.
lives, and trauma is the scary, yucky, painful stuff of childhood. That's the best way to think of it for kids. And we all have those things happen, but we don't all develop PTSD, mainly because we've got supportive adults who help us process those events so they don't remain stuck in our brains. But if you keep seeing, if there's a traumatic event and you keep seeing symptoms like we've described more than 3 months after the original event, then it can be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. And that just means that these kids aren't able to process it themselves. They need the help of a therapist or a caregiver to do it. And then the sooner you can work with them, the better, because part of dealing with unresolved trauma is you figure out these coping skills that are rarely healthy. You know, they've worked at the time to get away from the trauma and the threat, but they're not healthy in the long run.
Yes.
And if we don't treat early, those unhealthy behaviors become habits. And you know how hard it is to break a bad habit. If we can start treating it early, you have to treat the trauma, but you don't have to spend nearly as much time relearning good habits.
Yeah. And I think when you don't treat the trauma and get those healthy coping skills early, then you're adding smaller traumas into your life all the time by relationship difficulties. Maybe you can't keep a job, different things. So the earlier you kind of work it out, the better for someone.
Yes. And the more traumas a child is exposed to, that aren't treated, the more likely the trauma will turn into PTSD. That's a big risk factor. So if we can treat them early, maybe we can prevent a lot of the PTSD.
Okay, listeners, if you're wondering how do you find a trauma therapist for a child, then we recommend you follow some of Jolene's tips on how to find one and visit differentdream.com and use the search phrase, how to find a trauma therapist. And now back to our interview with Jolene.
So let's talk a little bit about the parent. So if you are a parent who has a child with trauma, how common is it for the parent to have PTSD as well?
Well, it depends on the trauma. I would say parents of kids with disabilities and special needs are often likely to be dealing with their own trauma of diagnosis and caring for their kids and all of those kinds of things. And the more difficult the behaviors are, the more likely it would be from the child, the more likely the parent is going to develop PTSD. The fewer supports the parent has, the more likely. The fewer chances the parent has to get away and decompress and, just kind of breathe for a while, the more likely it is. And we've got parents we're talking about here too, who may eventually be experiencing the death of a child. And so there's the grief trauma that comes along with it too. Even for children who aren't terminally ill, there's grief trauma because you're grieving the child you thought you would have, the parenting experience you thought you would have. That grief can often cause trauma that needs to be dealt with. And as you can imagine, an adult going through that really needs someone to talk to. So no parent should feel guilty if they're dealing with trauma related to caregiving, which can often is called compassion fatigue or secondary trauma. And it's very, very common.
So for people in the church, what should we know about PTSD?
It's incredibly common. Childhood trauma is incredibly common. And so is untreated childhood trauma that turns into PTSD. And probably 90% of the time, it is not the parent's fault. Now, if we're dealing with domestic abuse situations or, chronic substance abuse from the parents, yes, we can say it's part of them, but it's probably not due to bad parenting. And that's the first place we want to go, that these parents aren't raising their kids correctly. Or, like you said earlier, that the kids are just naughty. No, they've had something huge, overwhelming happen, and they're just stuck. The whole family becomes stuck. Well, aren't we as the church? I mean, we're supposed to help people get unstuck. That's what Jesus did all the time. He
Right.
would find people who were stuck, whether it was the leper or the blind man or Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector. So we need to realize that our job is to help these families get unstuck. And some ways we can do that are to provide some of those supports that
Mhm.
kids need, train our churches to be
Yeah.
trauma informed and
Yes.
safe places. So our workers in the church know how to recognize trauma and how to make church a safe place for kids, because
Right.
really that's what we need to do. I do
Right.
educator trainings,
Mhm.
and when I work with teachers, I tell them, you're not therapists. You
Right.
don't have to try and fix these kids. You just need to make the space they're in safe so that they
Yes.
can maybe learn, or and feel secure
Yeah.
for a while. And
Yeah.
that's what we need to be doing at church, making it a safe place so
Yeah.
kids can come and meet Jesus. That's
Right.
really what we need to do. And the more we can do, then, maybe providing those kids buddies, fiddling with the lighting and the sound, and all
Mhm.
sorts of things that we can do. And then provide for the parents things like support groups.
Yes.
Bring a counselor, find trauma counselors and therapists, and hook parents and families up to therapists,
Mhm.
so that they can start getting the treatment they need. Host a conference
Right.
about trauma in your church. And you know what? You're going to get churches from all around coming to that, because it's a big issue. And many of our churches are have things like foster and adopt
Mhm.
ministries. A lot of
Yeah.
our churches are helping, and we should. And a lot of our
Yeah.
churches are helping with refugees that are coming into the
Yep.
country. Those are
Mhm.
people who are going to be traumatized. And so,
Yes.
if we want to really meet all of their needs, we have to acknowledge that trauma is real.
Right.
It's not something we can push away. People who are dealing with trauma aren't weak. They aren't
Right.
possessed by the devil. They aren't,
Right.
they aren't going to be able to, any more than a diabetic can heal themselves. They aren't going to be able to heal
Right.
themselves and be supportive and provide what our families and children need.
Right.
Because if we do that and we can break those generational cycles of trauma, we are
Mhm.
going to have a much healthier church body and healthier families and healthier kids coming up to be the next generation of parents.
Right. And I would just add to that, I personally would consider trauma to be one of those invisible disabilities that we kind of talk about.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I think a very simple but extremely important thing that churches can do is make sure that you're a safe place and that the families don't feel judged or shamed. If
Yes.
you see someone talking about a family behind their back and something they wouldn't say in front of their face, shut that down. You know, just make people know that they are loved and accepted as they are. And I just think that if you don't do that, if you don't have a place where it truly feels welcoming and safe, where people can tell their stuff even when it's not Instagram friendly, then
Mm-hmm.
the rest of it doesn't matter because they're not going to come and they're not going to open up.
That's right. And all I can think about when I see people who are saying those things or reacting in that shaming manner is that you haven't had this experience yet,
Yet,
but you will.
right? Yes. Yeah.
Because it happens to every family at
Yes.
some point. Every
Right.
family.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So, Jolene, on your blog, differentdream.com, I noticed you had a series from parents who talked about PTSD. What was your biggest takeaway from that blog series?
Um, my biggest takeaway for that was that PTSD among parents is way more common than we realize. And that there are parents out there who are desperate for help. They are
Yeah.
hanging on by their fingernails.
Mhm.
I heard from parents who were like, I've been taking care of my child for 19 years and I'm a single parent and I have no help. Um,
Mhm.
and and boy, I just don't know how they all do it. I mean, I had my
Right.
own experience and it was hard, but I had a supportive husband and a supportive community and
Right.
some education that helped me access stuff. And some of these families are so consumed by their caregiving, they have no time for anything else.
Right.
And I think, and what I also saw there was that here is a place where we as a church should be stepping in
Yeah.
and helping these families.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we want to share the gospel and all that kind of stuff, but you know what? They can't even, for the most part, they are so drowning that that's not where they need us to start. They need us to start by just providing some support, you know, and being there for them. And if we can do that, we're going to help them. But man, that is a place where the church should be going.
So another part of your book that really stuck out to me was about a story about a little girl named Trinity, and Trinity had been through a lot of trauma, but she grew up to be really resilient. What can we learn from this?
Yeah, and I would want to tell you, first of all, that story about Trinity came from a book called Born to Love, which is by Dr. Bruce Perry. He's best known as the psychologist who went down after the Branch Davidian disaster in Waco, Texas, and worked with the children that were taken out of that. So he's dealt with a lot of kids who have trauma.
Wow.
But this woman, Trinity, that he interviewed, she was raised in a family where both her parents were addicted to heroin, and there were, a series of boyfriends cycling in and out. And yet she was able to grow up and become quite successful, I believe, as a social worker. And what she said made the difference were some people along the way who noted her strengths and told her about them. So she had a teacher who recommended that she be tested for the Talented and Gifted program. She had her father, she did have a few positive interactions with her father where she knew that she was loved by him. And then there were other people along the way that said, did you know you're good at this? You have a talent for this. And those things gave her enough of a window into the future and enough self-confidence to go beyond the environment where she was raised. Now, those are small things, little things. And so if this could be done in those kinds of situations for her, think of all we can do for children in our church. We should be, in our Sunday school programs, in any kind of midweek programming, VBS, wherever we are, we should be making sure we are getting to know the students, creating healthy relationships with them, and then speaking into them about their strengths and what they might be able to do someday. And not just, Jesus loves all the little children.
Right.
That's true. But our kids, and especially our kids who live with trauma, need to hear it in just in a way that is obviously specific to them. And that's going to make a difference. So now if you can take that with the love of Christ and the message of Christ and the support of a church body, we can make a tremendous difference in the lives of kids on this earth and for eternity. And that is so important.
I think that is really good stuff. I think people don't realize the power of just those words of affirmation, especially to people who don't hear them often. And I would just second that and say that this is especially true for kids who have behavioral issues because they get that positive affirmation so much less than other kids. And sometimes they even walk into a room and people are like, ugh. So if you can look past the behaviors and find something positive and compliment them on it, or say, I see your gift. How difference making can that be for a child?
It makes a huge difference. And when I taught school for 25 years, and I made sure that early on in the year, I found out what kids were good at or what they liked or what their area of interest was. And so somebody in the class was the expert on cats and somebody was the expert on monster trucks. And, so that if anything came up, then it's like, oh, okay, you need to know something about frogs. You need to talk to our frog expert, so-and-so. To build everybody up because everybody has something that they're good at. I had a situation when I was like in early junior high, maybe 7th grade. I was not a confident child, and I was, middle school are not your best years anyway. So
Then, yeah,
I was not looking my best back
yeah,
then.
yeah.
And I just didn't really think that I had come out of an elementary school experience where I was very poorly inclined athletically, and that was all that was important. And so I didn't have much confidence. Well, I met a girl and went to visit her family, and this gal became one of my best friends. But her dad, I'm not kidding, looked like the comedian Danny Kaye. And
Okay.
I would see him and I went, "You look so much like Danny Kaye. I just can't believe how much you look like Danny Kaye." And he would smile at me every time and he'd go, "Jolene, you look like Elizabeth Taylor."
Oh.
And for the rest of my high school years, he called me Liz then whenever he'd see me.
Uh-huh.
Now, I didn't get it really until years later that,
Yeah.
he was speaking the potential he saw rather
Yeah.
than the external. But it's like we need to do those kind of things for our kids too. He
Yeah.
was not mocking me in any way.
No.
He meant it.
Does that still make you feel a little emotional now when you think about it?
It does. It still does. In
Yes.
fact, I told his daughter that and what an impact he made on me through the years. And
Yeah.
she made sure and called me when he died because she said, "I
Yeah.
knew he meant a lot to you."
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that just shows that the power of
Yeah.
kindness and calling out beauty and gifts. I mean, let's
Yeah.
do more of that.
Yeah, exactly. Because I didn't look anything like Elizabeth Taylor, let me tell you. I still don't. But he saw something there.
Yeah, that's a beautiful story.
Yeah.
And going back to your original story about your son and the medical trauma and all the parenting you did through this, trying to figure it out, how important was your faith to you as you were trying to parent through this, all of this?
I would say my faith was really important to my husband and I. I struggled a lot. I struggled much more when our son was very young than my
Mhm.
husband did. And it was hard. I mean, we were in the hospital a lot. He had to use a feeding tube for months and months, and he was allergic to anything but breast milk. So I was pumping for almost
Oh
a
my
year,
goodness.
and we didn't always have enough, and he had a feeding version, and it was just. There was this one time where I was just beside myself
Yeah,
of, how are we going to even keep him alive? And we
right.
were in a very remote area where there wasn't like a breast milk bank or anything we could hook
Right.
into. And it was like one time God just put a hand on my shoulder and said, what are you so afraid of?
Yeah.
And I was like, well, my baby could die. And, through a series of just kind of thinking that through, well, so if he dies when he's 6 months old, what's that mean? Well, you would take him to heaven. So what are you so afraid of?
Right.
And then I'm thinking, well, yeah. And then, we wouldn't have to worry about his decision at some age, and we wouldn't have to
Right.
worry about puberty and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. And that just really calmed me down. Now, of course, our son lived and we had raging puberty and everything else that went along with it. He's doing
Yeah.
well now,
Yeah.
but I'm
Yeah.
like, God has a sense of humor there. See, I
Yeah.
told you he didn't have that much to be afraid of. And there have been other times where, I was just able to see that, especially the fact that we have a God who's a father and a God who is a son. And so
Yeah.
there's nothing that me as a parent or my child can experience that God hasn't experienced also.
Right.
And that has just, when I get to the end of everything,
Mhm.
that's where I can just kind of camp,
Yeah.
and just
Yeah.
rest for a while.
Yeah. So it sounds like your faith helped meet you in the moments that you needed in that day to day,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
gave you a foundation to help you keep going and see past the day.
Yeah. Really,
Yeah.
truly. And now
Yeah.
it's at that point where, okay, so if all of these things happen to me, and here's the education that I have and the training, and then here are the gifts that I have. What can I do now? Where's God leading me now
Right.
to minister to and prepare people who are in the
Yeah.
thick of those things now, or the
Yeah.
support people that surround them? What can I do
Yeah.
with what I've learned and what
Right.
God's given me to help others, because he certainly, he did it for me, but we serve a very economical God. So he did it for me, but it can help so many others.
Yeah. What would you tell a parent who's in that day-to-day struggle right now, parenting a child through PTSD or trauma?
I would just say to them, hang on, just hang on. And when you can't, ask God, put your hand over mine and hold on for me, because I just can't. And be honest with him. Be honest with him. Tell him what you need. Ask him to provide. And then when you've got a breather and you can do something, ask somebody for help. Because this is one of the things that we as caregiving parents often do not do. We think we have to handle it all by ourselves, and we don't let people in. And unless somebody has gone through the same thing you've gone through, they don't know what you need. They don't know how bad it is. They don't know how to help. So let some people in and ask for what you need. And then when you can help someone else, do that also, because that will take your eyes a little bit off of your own situation and onto others and back onto God.
So, Jolene, what would be, if people take one thing away from this interview today, what would you want them to take away?
Again, that trauma is very common. We all go through trauma in childhood. Childhood PTSD is more prevalent than you think, and it can be treated more effectively and earlier than most of us realize. So first and foremost, if we have kids who have a trauma history and they have trauma symptoms, do everything you can to try to get them in for some treatment, because you can make a big difference for them. And even if it takes a while, my son was 26 before he was treated for trauma that occurred at birth. It can help. It can make a big difference.
Yeah. That is great. Well, we have learned so much from talking to you today. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thanks for inviting me to be with you. I really have enjoyed it.
To learn more about Jolene's work supporting special needs families, please visit her award-winning blog, differentdream.com, or keep up with what's new in her life and her writing at jolenephilo.com. And if you want to know more about PTSD, I highly recommend that you pick up her book, Does My Child Have PTSD, on Amazon. And while you're there, take a look at her other books, including her newest venture, writing fiction. Check out her West River Mystery series, because I know you're going to love these cozy mysteries, which has its 4th book in the series, See Jane Dig, coming out in October 2024. And of course, to learn more about Wonderful Works, visit our website at wonderfulworks.net. And if you like this podcast, please subscribe and share. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.